Joining us now from Los Angeles is retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer. He's currently the president of KIP, a strategic risk management firm. Also from Washington, D.C., we have retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant Jessie Jane Duff, who is now at the London Center for Policy Research. Hal, let's start with you. As Dan just explained to us, there are some reports that it was in fact Israeli intelligence, Mossad, that warned the U.S. that Iranian proxy forces were preparing for a possible attack against U.S. forces, including in Iraq and Syria. What do you think that those targets could be? What would those attacks look like?
Michelle, those could be a number of different targets. It could be looking at forces we have deployed on the ground. It could be looking at our bases that we have over there. It could be our permanent bases. It could be our more expeditionary bases that we've been using in the fight against ISIS. In many of those places, even though we're fairly protected against certain types of threats, if there was a concerted threat by, say, Shiite militiamen who are working as proxies for the Iranians, that could really change the tactical dynamic on the ground. So there's a lot of different things. Now, one thing I will say is our naval forces are generally far more protected than they were back in the days of the USS Cole. So the chances of that particular type of strike or strikes that would hit our forces in a maritime situation are probably a lot less than they were back then. So it is a different sort of array of force protection procedures that we have and capabilities throughout the region. Mm-hmm. But obviously the intelligence must have been credible.
Jessie, National Security Advisor John Bolton making it very clear that this deployment is about sending a message to Iran that any attack on the U.S. or its interests will be met with, quote, unrelenting force. If Iran was planning some kind of attack, do you think that this now deters Iran?
Oh, of course it doesn't deter Iran. Iran is very aggressive. Right now, the sanctions are choking them off. We basically hit the anniversary in which we have removed ourselves from the Iran nuclear deal. And China, Turkey, and India were all informed that they could no longer do deals with Iran and their oil. So now, essentially, this is impacting their economy in a severe way. I don't expect that they will ever hold back. They've essentially been fearless in every attack that they've ever had against any of our allies. Keep in mind, this could also be an attack by Shia, Houthi, or Hezbollah, because those three are also proxies of the Iranian regime themselves. So when we're looking at what they will do, I think that they will be very cautious in their measure. This may essentially make them a little bit more strategic in their type and style of attack. But the U.S. has been a target by Iran for a number of decades now, and it's only going to get more aggressive now that we have choked them off, and the sanctions are only going to get more severe, and the rest of the world is suffering the impacts of their doing deals with Iran. I think that even Europe now is recognizing the U.S. is very serious about what we want to ensure that they no longer have this nuclear capability in any way, shape, or form.
Jessie, it's an excellent point that you raise, and it's something to stress that the threat may come from one of Iran's proxies, and the U.S. has made it very clear that it's going to hold Iran responsible for the actions of its proxies. Hal, in terms of its capabilities, how much of a military threat is Iran and its proxies to the U.S.?
Well, they are a threat. They have a tremendous missile capability throughout the Persian Gulf. They have a naval presence that can launch missiles and other sorts of weapon systems. They do have an air force. Obviously, what we have in terms of combat power far outweighs what they have, but they could inflict quite a bit of damage. Our response, if they try to do that, would be overwhelming. And it is not a stretch to say that we could, in fairly short order, pretty much destroy the Iranian Navy and their offensive air capability with their Air Force. Albeit with that said, they have a lot of other capabilities, and they have all their essentially 4 deployed proxies. They have this huge terrorism potential, if you will, and capability throughout not just the region, but literally throughout the world. And the big concern is you get into a shooting war with Iran, and all of a sudden you find terrorist attacks happening in places very far, far away from the Middle East, not just in Europe, but North America and even elsewhere around the world.
Elsewhere around the world, you mentioned that point, Helen. Hezbollah, one of Iran's proxies, is a player in Venezuela, keeping in mind that the U.S. is embroiled or involved or keeping its eye on a number of other hot button issues around the world. We've got the chaotic mess in Venezuela. We have another round of rocket tests from North Korea. Jesse, is this potentially too much for the U.S. to handle all at once?
Well, I think that the U.S. has been very prepared for any type of confrontation with Iran for some time. And you brought up a very good point that the nuclear capability that North Korea has largely been with them merchandising it to Iran. A lot of what Iran's capabilities have happened are the result of their relationship with Kim Jong-un. That is what been largely suspected. That is what many of the intel sources are very, very confident has happened. Venezuela, right in our own backyard, we have this threat. They have infiltrated on so many levels that it doesn't necessarily have to come from their very Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It can essentially come from many different aspects throughout the world. And this threat could have a confrontation towards our U.S. or the allies. We're talking about the Gulf states. We're talking about Saudi Arabia, which would naturally align itself with the U.S. and obviously and the UAE. But we have forces in Syria, we have forces in Iraq, and we have those that are deployed in special operating areas that are obviously going to be quite at risk, and it's very hard sometimes to recognize who your enemy is when they are the proxy forces of the Iranians.
Hal, very quickly, is there a scenario where you see the U.S. taking a preemptive strike?
Potentially, if we saw them moving, certainly any types of weapons of mass destruction where they could impact our forces, putting them into position where they could be employed, that would trigger a preemptive strike. I don't know if you'd say preemptive per se, but if we actually were hit by proxy, probably Hezbollah would be a likely proxy. And if they were hit in a place where we really didn't expect it, for example, if we were hit in North America and the United States, that could possibly trigger a major response. And it would be swift and it would be overwhelming.
All right, Hal Kempfer, thank you so much. Jesse, Jane Duff, appreciated as always.